Today, let's talk vintage gear. It's gonna be a fun one. Hey everyone, I'm Cool Caparoon. Thank you for stopping by for another video. I thought this would be fun. One, because very few people get a chance to experience vintage, like real vintage microphones and hardware. And I feel like there is a lot that goes into vintage gear that no one really talks about. So today we're gonna be discussing all things vintage. Let's get into it. Now, the first thing that may not be common knowledge if you've never used vintage gear before is that they all sound different. Just because you have 5 vintage 1176s or 5 vintage 251s, that does not mean, even if they're close in serial number, even if they're sequential serial numbers, that does not mean that they are all gonna sound the same. There can be a gigantic difference in the way 2 of the exact same models sound when we're talking about vintage gear, and it's for a whole bunch of reasons. It's how well it was kept up. Has it ever been repaired? Are there original caps, tubes, resistors, etc. inside? How did those things age because of just chance or environmental factors? How often was it left on? All kinds of stuff. What kind of tubes are in it? Has it been replaced? Are they exactly the same as the factory tubes? Tubes change in the way that they sound throughout the life of the tube. And then like environmental factors, for instance, like, was someone spitting into the microphone every time they tracked into it? Was there a lot of moisture that went into that microphone and it was used every single day over 50 years? Or was it just put in a closet and never used at all? Contrary to what some of you might think, that the one that just went in the closet and was never used at all doesn't necessarily mean that it's the better sounding one. Sometimes things can age even worse when they're not being used. So if you're ever interested in a piece of vintage gear, you need to go into it knowing that every single example sounds different, even if it's the same model number and even if the serial numbers are very close. So the best practice, if you can hear it or test it, do that before buying, if it's at all possible. And if it's not possible, just know that you might be getting a dud or one that just doesn't have all of the magic. I'm gonna do my best to go like pro, con, pro, con, pro, con throughout this video, because there are some really cool parts about hardware, vintage hardware and microphones, and there's definitely some cons. All right, so we are in Blackbird Studio E with Zach Miller. We just finished recording a bunch of vocals for his upcoming EP. This is a really cool studio. So I want to walk you through a couple things. Big old Neve console today. Let's turn this around. So then here's the racks of just ridiculous amounts of gear. 2500, 1176s, LA2As, distressors, Chandlers, 1073s. So today we are running 1073 into the CL1B. There's a nice Pultec right there. And let me show you in here the microphone selection. So what we did is we had them set up 3 microphones, which I'll throw some B-roll up here on the screen, set up 3 microphones to see which one sounded best for Zach. And so what we got here is we have a U67, a vintage U67, a U87, and the vintage U87, and then a beautiful 251. And of course, the 251 is the one that won. Of course, that's what I expected. 251s are just, they're absolutely unbelievable. So that's what we ended up tracking on vintage 251. This is the monitoring setup where he gets to mix all of his own stuff. And this is the booth in here in Studio E at Blackbird. And one of the coolest parts about this room is the fact that these panels flip open here. So if you're tracking drums in here or something, and you want a little bit more liveliness, you can open these giant panels up around the room, and it gets significantly more live in here, which is really cool. Walk through this extremely heavy door into the control room. Awesome size control room. Sounds great. Some ATC 150s, and then I'll show you the machine room real quick. We get our own lounge in here, coffee, snacks, whatnot. And then the machine room. There's power supplies for the Neve. And then we have all of the interfaces here, Pro Tools HD rig, all the network stuff, the actual Lexicon 480. But the thing that I have not seen yet, this is my first time seeing one in person, is the computer that they're running. The new tiny Mac Mini, which is super, super dope. And it ran flawlessly the entire time. I'm very, very impressed with this computer. Now, what is funny about that to me is I was posting on Instagram, on my Insta story, when I was in the studio, and I was like, oh, we got this microphone and we're doing this thing and here's this. And there are so many people that frequent Blackbird Studios that they were replying to my Insta story debating which serial number of 251s that Blackbird has sounds the best. And this just goes to show you how different they all sound. So, what is one of the biggest pros of vintage hardware? There's two really big ones. I'm going to say that the first one is not even the sound quality of it. I think the biggest thing with vintage hardware that is cool is its rarity. When you're holding a vintage 251 and it is worth $30,000. Some of them are going upwards of $45,000. And you're holding this. It's a different thing than holding a new microphone. It doesn't even matter if it sounds the same. It is a different thing. And it is so cool, to me at least, it is so cool and so inspiring. And that's one of the reasons that we booked Blackbird with Zach Miller to go do this, is just the vibe, the inspiration of it all. Yes, it's more expensive. Yes, it's more expensive to go book a studio like that than to track at your own place. But the vibe, when he's in the booth there and he's singing through, I don't know, a $45,000 chain in a world-class studio, like, it's a different thing. Now, you may not be interested in that thing, but I promise you, it is a different thing. The seriousness at which you take everything, the level of inspiration that you might have when you're using those tools it's pretty cool. That probably leads me right into maybe the biggest con of vintage hardware, the price, because boy, has this stuff gotten just completely out of hand. There are stories, I know people who have stories of finding 1176s, vintage 1176s, even blue stripes, in the dumpster behind studios in like the 90s. Like, you couldn't give this stuff away just not that many years ago. And now I think the last vintage blue stripe 1176 that I saw went for like $27,000. Why? Like, you couldn't give that away. You couldn't get $1,000 for one of those just 20 years ago. So the cost, I think the cost is absolutely the most difficult part about vintage hardware and microphones, because it is outrageously expensive. We'll talk about if it's worth it here in a little bit. Now, a very, very cool part about using vintage microphones and vintage hardware is the fact that it all sounds unique. The con is that every one of them sounds different, but that's also a pro, is that it is a little bit easier to get a truly unique sounding record when you're using vintage hardware. And it's for a couple reasons. One, because not that many people actually have vintage hardware, so that's part of it. But then two, even the people that have the exact same thing as you, it doesn't sound the same as yours. Now, I do feel like as we move on into this music industry and music production becomes more and more and more accessible to more and more people, which I think is a great thing, the more records are kind of starting to sound the same. A lot of the vocals all sound the same. A lot of the drum sounds are all sounding the same because they're all programmed, especially electronic percussion. It's like, there's so much of it just sounds so similar. It's for this reason that some of the biggest and best producers out there have gigantic sample libraries, because they are searching for unique sounds. But you can accomplish this to a degree with vintage gear, because it just sounds different than the new stuff that you can buy, and it definitely sounds different than the same 4 or 5 or 8 different microphones that every bedroom producer and every up-and-coming producer is recording with. Is it worth the money? Well, like I said, we're going to talk about that. Another huge con of vintage hardware is maintenance, because this gear has been probably used for many years, and some of it has not been taken the best care of for many, many years. And so the likelihood of buying a vintage microphone or a vintage piece of hardware and it needing heavy maintenance is not uncommon. That is pretty common. And if it doesn't need maintenance right when you get it, it is not uncommon for it to need maintenance in the lifespan that you own it. Now, it's not to say that new hardware is exempt from this. I have new hardware that I've had to maintain and replace tubes and do stuff with that I haven't had for all that many years. But definitely when you get a vintage piece of gear, it's a different thing when it comes to the maintenance. I did a video with Tyler Bryant about a year ago on Holy Grail guitar recording rig. And I'm looking at it right now, I have a point-to-point hand-wired Fender Deluxe Reverb. And the coolest part about it, the hand-wired version, is the fact that it is, it is 95%, 90 to 98% of what a real vintage deluxe reverb is, but without any of the immediate maintenance concerns. I know that I'm going to have that amp for 10 or 12 years and be ripping on it and not really have to do anything to it because I'm getting a new recreation of it. We should talk more about new recreations of vintage gear here in a bit. But maintenance is absolutely a con in terms of how often you are actually going to have to work on something. If you buy an old mixing console, like there's always going to be a channel that's out of it. Like it just is what it is. It is part of the game of having vintage hardware. But if it's so maintenance intensive and so expensive, why would anyone own it? Well, it's partially because the uniqueness of it. It's partially because of the inspiration of it when you hold it and when you use it. But it's also partially because of the sound of it. I don't care what anyone says, vintage hardware and vintage microphones have a vibe. It's not to say it's the right move for everyone. It's not to say that you should want it because of the vibe, but it is definitely a different thing. They have a lot of vintage gear, microphones and hardware, just have a bigness to it, a size to it, a warmth to it, a thickness to it. Now, this could be for a whole range of reasons, whether it's like deteriorating parts, deteriorating tubes and caps and resistors, or just the difference in the components themselves, because we can't even make components today like we used to. We can't make tubes in the whole world. We can't make tubes the way they used to. Like a lot of this gear cannot be made anymore the way that it was made 50 years ago. So then we get down to the question, is vintage gear worth it? And that's a little bit harder to unpack. Before we get on to that, there are links in the description for every piece of gear that I own and use on a daily basis. And just about all of those links go to Sweetwater. So anytime you guys need any piece of musical gear whatsoever, you can jump on any one of my videos, click on any link in the description of any video. And once you're on the site, you can purchase anything that you need, anything that you were going to buy anyway. It costs you absolutely nothing extra. But it goes a long ways to help support this channel and help me keep making content just like this. So thank you so much to Sweetwater for sponsoring this video. And thank you to you guys for using the links in the description. Anytime you need to purchase anything, I very much appreciate you guys supporting the people who support me and support this channel. Thank you very much. Is it worth it? I don't own any vintage gear. We'll just start there. Because it's a hard sell. It really is. It is a different thing. It sounds different. The vibe is different. The level of inspiration is different. You feel like you're just doing that much more serious stuff because this is a crazy microphone. Unfortunately for me personally, it's the cost and the maintenance that keep me from investing in vintage gear. I'm in the market for a 251. That's going to be the next thing that I acquire, a 251 style microphone. And I can't justify a vintage one. They're super cool, but I just can't justify it. And so I'm now on the hunt for what is the best current production 251. What is the best sounding, closest to vintage sounding, overall well-rounded, high quality. It's not going to be cheap, I know that, but what's the best current thing that's being made for me and for what I'm looking for? Because it's going to be, at the most expensive, a third of the price of a vintage one. And at the very worst case scenario, it's going to need a tenth of the maintenance of a vintage one. So who is vintage gear actually for? Well, collectors for sure. If you're into collecting stuff, I don't judge that at all. If you want to just go for a single holy grail piece, and you're okay with the fact that it's going to need some maintenance and it may die in the middle of a session, and you're okay with the money that it costs to buy vintage stuff, that's who vintage stuff is for. But man, I feel like it depends on the thing, but I feel like current stuff is so good when you choose the right ones. That Fender Deluxe Reverb, the point-to-point hand-wired custom 65 Deluxe, I think it's called. I'll put a link down below. It is so good sounding. It's so in the ballpark of a vintage one. When I did my 1176 shootout, which I'll link that video down below, I shot out 2 vintage 1176s with the current production 1176 and compared it to my 3 favorite 1176 plugins. And it was a very enlightening video. For me personally, hardware won 10 times out of 10 times. Now, of course, you have the problem of not having infinite channels of hardware, but it won all the time. What I was really surprised at is I didn't like the blue stripe the best, and that was the most expensive one. What I was also really surprised at is on most things, I actually preferred the current production 1176. Not on every source, but on most sources. And that is not the result that I expected going into that shootout. I absolutely did not expect to like the current production better than the vintage ones. So I will put links to that video, the 1176 shootout video, and the video that I did with Tyler Bryant on the Fender Deluxe. And I'm also going to put a link to a video down below that I did on going to Blackbird Studio E with Zach. And it's a cool video about everything that I take to the session. There is also the top link in the description down below is an email list. I'm getting ready to launch some merch. I've already expanded. I'm going to do hats, t-shirts, and hoodies. And so it is going to be very cool stuff, not Cole Caparoon merch, but studio related merch. And I think you guys are going to really dig it. So if you want notified of that when it goes live, sign up in the email list down below. Also, we're working on the next signature model of Caparoon hardware, and it's a banger. I'm not going to try to oversell it, but it is pretty insane. So sign up for that because I'll be notifying. You'll get an early notification if you're signed up on the email list for when that hardware goes live. The last drop that we did of signature hardware sold out in 22 hours. And so if you want early access or early notification that it's coming, be sure to sign up to the email list. I hope you found this interesting, informative, entertaining, educational. We'll see you in the next one. Peace.